Hello, welcome to Jason the Old Millennial. My name is Jason, speaking to you here in my basement in the great state of Kansas. Today's video, I'm continuing part 2 of my deep dive on the band Genesis. The first part, I basically talked about how they begun, how they got together, all that, how the band actually changed quite a bit. We got to our 4th drummer, Phil Collins, and of course would stick with the band for quite a long time. Pretty good drummer and singer himself. And we kind of went through the Peter Gabriel period, which went through their first 6 albums. And so Peter Gabriel quits the band, and now we're going to go to part 2, see what happens to the band after that point. So let's get to it here on Jason the Old Millennial. Hello everybody, hope everybody's doing well here on a, what is it now, Friday afternoon. Yeah, getting ready for the weekend. All that, hope everybody's doing well. Definitely getting very hot here in Kansas. But yeah, continuing on my deep dive on the band Genesis. Pretty new band to myself, as I said in the first part. What I really knew about Genesis was Phil Collins. So the whole Peter Gabriel part was very new to me. Of course, the first part with Peter Gabriel was very prog rock. Not my style. I'm not a big fan of the first 6 albums, to be honest. Lamb Lies Down Broadway is definitely my favorite out of those first 6. I gave that an 8 out of 10. My favorite Peter Gabriel performance overall. So now we're going to shift a little bit in the band. As Peter Gabriel, like I said, he left, started his solo career. So what was the band going to do? They need a new lead singer. And it's going to be hard to follow Peter Gabriel, who's a very good singer and was a big part of the band and a founding member as well. So they were auditioning different people to try to fill in that role. In fact, they pretty much wrote the next album already. They have the next album ready to go. They just need a lead singer to sing it. So everything was ready, but every single they auditioned just didn't feel like they quite worked out. Didn't quite have the feel. Didn't hit the, couldn't, I remember one said that they were pretty good, but they couldn't quite hit the high notes that they needed for the song or whatever. Anyways, but they happen to have a really good singer already in the band, which is Phil Collins. Like I said, I don't think Phil Collins ever thought himself as a lead singer. Just he was wanting to be the drummer and can also do background vocals very well, which made him pretty viable to the band because of that. Because some of the other guys couldn't background sing as well as Phil Collins. But anyway, so Phil Collins took his turn on a song, and I think called Squonk, which is a song off of the next album. And he did a pretty good job. To the band heard him and said, you know, you did pretty good. Why don't you lead sing for the next album? So yeah, so that's what they went with, Phil Collins. Phil, from what I understand, thought that, okay, they just need someone to fill in for this next album. And then I don't think he thought himself as the permanent lead singer. Just, all right, well, I'll take over for this next album. Then after that, we'll find a new lead singer. So I don't think he thought himself as definitely the lead singer of the band. But definitely a good choice, which is crazy. Phil Collins has an amazing voice. One of my favorite male singers of all time. I like you even better than Peter Gabriel, and I think Peter Gabriel's pretty good as well. So yeah, so we get to the next album. He goes, sings these songs. They put out the next album. Their 7th album called A Trick of the Tail, coming out in 1976. And Trick of the Tail, it's still kind of the prog rock style album, somewhat longer songs and all that. No real big hits off of here. Nothing played on the radio, basically. But it did pretty well still. It went number 10 in the UK and, wait a minute, sorry. I'm reading the wrong notes. Went number 3 in the UK and number 31 in the US. So still a top 3 album in the UK. And for me, this is the first really, really good album for Genesis. I really like this album. This is one of my favorite Genesis albums. And it's interesting, it comes during kind of this more prog rock period. But yeah, this is the first album I came across. Like I said, I like Lamb Down on Broadway pretty well, But this album is even better than that, I think. I gave this album a 9 out of 10. I give it a really good score. Like I said, top-notch album. Even though it doesn't have any, it's not part of Phil Collins' pop era, which will come later. But the songs are very beautiful, I think. Very well done. I especially love the song Ripples. Ripples is one of my favorite Genesis songs. And if you don't know Ripples, definitely check out that song off the album. Check that album out. If you want to check, my recommendation personally is check out Trick of the Tail. Is definitely a Genesis album to get into. I prefer that over getting to like Foxtrot or something like that, which is a little bit of a crazier album with longer songs and all that. But yeah, the songs, a lot of beautiful songs there. Ripples just so beautiful, great chorus. Phil Collins just killing it on the vocals. Yeah, definitely listen to that album. Overall, the songs are all very good. Yeah, so yeah, Trick or Tail, very good album. Should be a bigger album for them, but it still did pretty good in the UK. Still catch on in the US. They'll catch on a little bit better later on, but yeah, so after that, they kind of felt like Phil Collins could be the lead singer. I think Phil Collins wasn't sure necessarily he's still the lead singer, but they kept going on the next album with him as the lead. Interesting enough, the band kind of went down to a trio. So the band started off with like 5 members. But we got Peter Gabriel left, of course, Anthony Phillips left, all that. So now the 3 members are, you got Phil Collins as drummer, lead singer. Then you got Tony Banks as the keyboard player, and Mike Rutherford as the guitarist. So those are our 3 members now in 1977. So the band's now those 3. So it definitely changes a lot now that they went from the 5-piece band to a 3-piece band. Of course, Phil Collins, usually when they toured, they hired another drummer to drum while he did the lead singing quite often for that. But yeah. So their 8th album was funny enough called Then There Were Three, which came out in 1978, kind of referring to the fact that they went from this 5-piece band to a 3-piece band, which is kind of a funny title for them. It's a fairly forgettable album from what I remember. I gave it a 7 out of 10. Yeah, not great. Just kind of more in the middle. It has one really great song on this album, which was Follow You, Follow Me, which was a big radio hit. Really good Phil Collins. The typical Phil Collins kind of pop performance. Very nice melody, great vocal work, very catchy. Went number 7 in the UK and number 23 in the US, so big hit in both countries. In fact, it's the highest charting single at that point. Like I said, going through all the Peter Gabriel stuff, none of those songs were hits on the radio. And nothing even on that 6th album, Trick of the Tail, though it was a good album, no hits on it. So this is really the first big hit that they had, and it came with the 8th album. So they're 8 albums in, and, roughly, 9 years or so into their recording career, they finally come with a hit, which to me I always thought was kind of crazy, like that they were able to, a band like that kept going. Like their albums, I said, in the UK were doing well enough, and so they kept going, but they weren't really a big band to me. They were just an okay band. They're more bigger in the UK. US, they weren't really that well known, I don't think, comparatively. But they weren't a top-notch band at this point, in my opinion. I might be wrong. I wasn't alive during that time, so someone who was alive could tell me differently. But yeah, that was the first time they really kind of were like, all right, they're catching on the radio now. And they would continue on the success, of course, as this goes. But the album itself went number 3 in the UK and number 14 in the US. So again, even with only one hit single off the album, still top 3 UK albums, doing well in the UK. Every album right now is top 10, top 3 album. Quite a bit, actually. Ever since Selling England by the Pound, they've been hitting top 3. So yeah, doing very well. US, that's the best they've done in the US, number 14. So definitely crawling. I think they're getting more noticed in the US, maybe because of the hit single that they got off this album. Now, they did have a new guitar player named Daryl Stuermer join the band. So they went from they had a whole album called now, and then there were 3, and then now they added a 4th member as well. And so that goes into their next album, which is called Duke, which came out in 1980. This is their ninth album, and it did very well. It's the biggest album for them up to this point. It feels like at this point, every album is building on top of each other, and they're getting more notice. They're getting more hit songs. Every album's starting to really do very well. In fact, they got #1 in the UK. So first time we get a #1 album in the UK. We've been top 3 for like 3 or 4 albums in a row, and this one hits #1. So it gets me to say, yeah, it's definitely getting more popular, catching on with the audience a lot more. And it went #11 in the in the US. So it's almost a top 10 album in the US as well. Like a lot of these albums are getting barely in the top 40, and now they're almost top 10. And I think, I think it's because the singles are getting better. And I don't know if that's because Phil Collins starting to, give more input into the songwriting. Like I said, I think we're going away from prog rock at this point and more into pop rock. And I think that's helping their popularity again. Prog rock, I feel like there's a cult following for bands like that, but they don't get big hits on the radio. For the general audience, aren't as big a fan of these type of prog rock bands. Like I said, I didn't know Genesis really at all growing up because they just didn't have as many big hits as some of these other bands. But yeah, so this album doing very well, and it turns out two big singles. It looks like "Turn It On Again," which went #8 in the UK, and "Misunderstanding," which went #14 in the US. "Misunderstanding" is one I know a lot. That's a big hit on the radio. Another real good, catchy song, and something about Phil Collins' voice. Phil Collins' voice really works well in this new style that they've this new kind of more pop rock style, and the songs are just getting more catchier and just more airworms, I guess, and which is helping a lot. And for me, yeah, this is definitely becoming a much better part of the era for me, much better than the Peter Gabriel era for me personally. Duke was a decent album overall. I gave an 8 out of 10, so I gave it a solid score. It's towards the top half of my Genesis albums. Again, I think it's definitely, the albums are getting better. I like the pop rock style more than prog rock, so that makes sense for me personally. But yeah, so Duke doing very well. So we go up to the 10th album. The 10th album is called Abacab, which comes out in 1981. So just a year later, they come out with another album. So they're starting to put out albums a little bit even more frequently. Again, does very well. Went #1 in the UK and #7 in the US. So first time top 10 album for the US and second in a row, #1 in the UK. So yeah, at this point, we're getting the 80s. I feel like especially, I mean, they start out, I always think it's crazy, that 70s period. To me, the 80s period is definitely the most successful period of the band and where they got bigger hits. Their albums are doing very, very well. So I always felt like Genesis was an 80s band. I always forget that they started out, more they started in the late 60s basically, but really flourished, or really kind of started to flourish during the 70s and really flourished in the 80s. I feel like that's when they really hit their peak anyways. And so that's what we're getting right now with even this album, Abacab. Again, it has 2 fairly big hits on it. No Reply at All went #29 in the US, and Keep It Dark went #33 in the UK. Not as big hits as Misunderstanding or Follow You, Follow Me, definitely are bigger hits, but still putting out some hits out there. Me personally, I don't like Abacab, actually. It's one of my least favorite albums. I give it a 6 out of 10. Even those 2 singles I didn't think were really that great. They weren't radio hits that I can remember. And yeah, none of the music really was that catchy or that great, which, like I said, Duke, pretty good, 8 out of 10. This 6 out of 10. It really took a step back for me personally. But I know a lot of my friends really like this album that are Genesis fans. I don't know why it didn't hit with me. It's hit with other Genesis fans, I guess. All right. Well, I didn't write down the 11th album down on my notes. Sometimes I skip albums if they didn't really do anything. So now I have to figure out. Maybe Wind and Withering came. I might have missed that album. Sorry. Do my notes. Looking at my notes here. Yeah, I think Wind and Withering maybe came next as their 11th album. But I didn't write anything down, so it must not have done anything special. That's why I didn't write it down. Actually, a decent album. I gave that album an 8 out of 10 as well. My favorite song was Your Own Special Way. Again, Wind and Withering didn't have a huge hit off of it. And that's probably why I didn't write it down in my notes. I didn't really, I don't know if it did anything or would have wrote it down maybe, but uh, either way, yeah, Wind and Withering, another album that came out, which was decent. So it's definitely, for me, it was like Duke an 8 out of 10, Abby Cab 6 out of 10, and then this 8 out of 10. So they're doing pretty good. They had that one misstep to me, but they're still doing fairly solid at this point, in my opinion. So we'll go to the 12th album, which I wrote down in my notes, which is just called Genesis. They came with this self-titled album for the 12th album, which is a little interesting. Usually that's like your first album is usually like your self-titled one, but you know, I mean, Beatles did self-titled later on in their career too. But anyway, this came out in my birth year, 1983, year I was born, and this did very well as well. It went number one in the UK. So this is now like the third or fourth number one now in the UK. So I mean, they're all hitting pretty good. Went number 9 US, another top 10 album for the US as well. It's not an album you hear a lot about though, but it did have 2 big singles off of it. One called Mama that went number 4 in the UK, and That's All went number 6 in the US. That's All. That's All. It looks like it's probably the biggest single so far for the US. Number 6 is pretty darn good, the highest they've had. And That's All is a really good song. It's another one of my favorite, actually, Genesis songs. Very catchy, great piano. It's one you've probably heard before. If you hear it, you probably remember if you've listened to radio like I have. But yeah, very good. For me, Genesis was a little step back. I gave it a 7.5 out of 10, so not as good as Duke or Wind and Withering, I think. It's back a little bit, but not as bad as like Abacab for me, or even I'm forgetting what was the other one. Then there were 3, which were like 7 and 6, both for me. Yeah, That's All is my favorite song off of it. That's All is a great song. It's definitely one of the Phil Collins. It's funny, a lot of the songs I'm like, yeah, it's a Phil Collins. It feels like this could be on Phil Collins' solo album, and I love Phil Collins' solo work a lot. He's one of my favorite artists, so I do love these more Phil Collins solo style songs. Are really working for me. But yeah, 12 albums in, they're doing pretty well at this point. But following the Genesis album, they decided to take a little bit of a break. 1984, they all went and did their own solo projects. Even I think Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks even did some. I know I was reading about them, also was doing some solo work as well. Of course, the biggest member is Phil Collins. His solo work really skyrocketed at this point. And of course, the thing about Phil Collins at this point in his life, he was going through divorce with his wife. In fact, he kind of took a break so he could try to save his marriage, basically, because he's been away from his wife, you know, touring a lot during this time period, and their relationship kind of fell apart. And so he's trying to fix it, but ends up not fixing it. In fact, I forget where they're living, and of course, he's from England, but he had to kind of move to where his wife's at, but it didn't work out, and they ended up getting divorced anyway. So he's going through a lot himself, and I think that's why I think that's a big reason why Phil Collins wanted to take a break, because he's going through a lot personally in his life. But he does come out with again, I didn't write all this stuff down, but I know he comes out with a Face Value, and that becomes a huge hit. His first solo record, which I'll get more into when I do my Phil Collins deep dive. But Face Value has a lot of songs kind of written about the breakup, his marriage, his divorce, you know. So it's a very personal, emotional album for himself, and does very, very well. It's a great album. I'll get to that at some other point. Love that album, but of course, In the Air Tonight, huge hit off that album. Kind of becomes one of his staple songs that he plays at one of the big, you know, hits in any concert he does. And it's a radio staple, you know, and it's if not one of the most songs he's most well known for. So Face Value, boom, huge hit. His second album is pretty good as well. I think it's Hello, I Must Be Going. And then we'll get to his next album called No Jacket Required. comes out in 1984. And this, like I said, his first two albums doing pretty well. This third album is best album. I mean, as far as I think, best-selling album, and all that. I think I'm trying to think. I think I have the album here, but he has like "Take Me Home," I believe. Let's see. No, I don't have that one. I have Face Value, but I don't have. I need to get No Jacket Required. It has some great songs on it. I'll get at some other point. And in fact, the album ended up winning Grammy Album of the Year. That's how good of an album that was. So it's the only album that he won Album of the Year for. I think during his period, he also puts out like, I'm forgetting because I don't have my notes on that yet. But he puts out the really big hit song. Take a Look at Me Now. I'm thinking of the song in my head right now. I can't think of the name of the song, but anyways, a huge hit song off of a movie. I think got an Oscar nomination for best song. So he was just having one big hit after another at this point. Solo wise, Phil Collins just skyrocketed up as a big hit solo artist of the 80s. And he's still with Genesis, though. This is what I think is very funny, is that he's still with the band Genesis. They didn't break up. They're just taking a break. Basically, he goes off and has like one of the most successful solo careers while they're on their break. But they do come back and make some more albums together. So this, to me, I'm like, man, Phil Collins was like, to me, he's like the king of the 80s. Because he was putting out, like I said, he's winning Grammys. He's getting nominated for Oscars. He's doing all this incredible stuff. And then he goes back to Genesis and has some of his best work with Genesis. Some of the best-selling albums. And maybe they're best-selling because Phil Collins as a solo artist is doing so well. So I'm sure everybody's like, wow, Phil Collins, So when he goes back to Genesis, everybody's like interested in what Phil Collins is putting out with Genesis. So Genesis really kind of benefits from the popularity of Phil Collins' solo career, I think, at this point. But we'll get to that. Again, I do Phil Collins. So in 1986, they come back together, like I said. So only about 3-year break while Phil Collins, like I said, doing very well. And they come out with their 13th album, which is their biggest album. Like I said, what's crazy, Phil Collins puts out No Jacket Required. It's his biggest album of all time, solo-wise. And then Invisible Touch, his next Genesis album, is the biggest album for Genesis. Huge seller. The most hit singles they've ever had on the album. Went number 1 in the UK, number 3 in the US. So again, it's like their fifth, like number 1 in the UK. And first time they went number 3 in the US. So the best selling they've had in the US by far at this point. And it's a 13th album. So it's always crazy to me. Like, man, you went 13 albums before you really start hitting your peak, which is just insane to me. Like how they stayed together during those periods that they weren't selling so well. And then now they're starting to really, and we see that in some other bands, but always kind of interesting to me. Because this band almost seems way different than, like I said, the Peter Gabriel period. Because this is pure pop rock. I mean, this is just really great pop music. And this is their best pop, like, sounding album. So much different than what they did with Foxtrot, which is their biggest, like, prog rock album. But yeah, it's their best-selling album. 7 million copies sold. Did incredibly well. And most, like I said, they usually have maybe 1 or 2 hit singles off each album. This had 5 hit singles off of it. I mean, 5. That is incredible. That is very hard to do. You don't get that very often. Like I said, you're lucky if you can get like 2 hit singles off of an album, but they had 5 that reached top 5 in the US singles chart. So 5 songs was in the top 5, reached top 5 in the singles chart. That is absolutely incredible. The songs being Invisible Touch, Throwing It All Away, Land of Confusion, Into Deep, and Tonight, Tonight, Tonight are the 5 songs that charted incredibly well. And yeah, this for me is my favorite album from, I would say, the next album's really good as well, but this is, I'd say it's their best album. This is the first album I listened to too. My friends, when they were like trying to get me into Genesis, they said, okay, let's try this. This might be the best album to be introduced to Genesis. I totally agree. It's like if I was recommending getting to Genesis, like I would say listen to Invisible Touch first. And if you don't like that album, you're not gonna like Genesis because it's hard not to like that album. That is the best selling or best sounding album. Their most catchiest hits, the most radio friendly, album that they have is this one. And I gave it a 9.5 out of 10. So it's almost a perfect 10 out of 10 album for me. And yeah, there's like 3 songs off here that are my favorite Genesis songs of all time come off this album. Visible Touch, amazing song, super catchy. Land of Confusion, another big radio hit for them. It's amazing. Again, that chorus is so, it's so catchy. And the music too is really good. The instrumentation, all that, really great. It's 80s, so it's getting more the synth 80s pop sound. And the drum beats are sounding a little more this, I forget what you call it, digital drum beats or something like that. The drumming sounds a little different, but all works really well. And my favorite song actually is Into Deep, which may be my favorite. I haven't put that together, but Into Deep definitely is going to be towards the top of my favorite song from Genesis. It is an amazing ballad from Phil Collins. Very beautiful, really showcases how good Phil Collins is as a singer. Like I said, he's been singing some really good ballads at this point. Like I said, the other song that I can't remember on top of my head, I love that song too. And he's just killing it vocally, writing, everything. So yeah, Invisible Touch, 13th album, really, really good. The band actually takes another 5 years off to work on solo projects. So they took 3 years off, came out with their biggest album of all time, and then decided to go back to solo. And it's funny, like Invisible Touch to me, you could that could be a Phil Collins solo album. I mean, it sounds like his solo work that he's doing at this point, which I think is kind of really cool. It's like, man, he's just killing it. He's putting out his solo work, putting out Genesis sounds like his solo work. Almost to me, almost like why does he even go back to Genesis, or why does he go back to solo work? Like it feels like the same thing at this point. So they took 5 years off, came back in 1991 with their 14th album. I should say Phil Collins does come out with my favorite album, But Seriously, which is an amazing album, my favorite of his solo work. But again, like I said, he's coming out with my best solo work and my favorite Genesis albums, all in this 80s period up to now 91 is definitely my favorite period of the band. And their 14th album, We Can't Dance, also did very well. It's another really great album. It's like Invisible Touch to me. Invisible Touch and We Can't Dance, to me, listen to those 2 albums first. Those are their best sounding albums. Their catchiest albums. Those are their more pop albums. More friendly, radio friendly albums and commercially successful albums. Of course, a lot of people would say Genesis sold out. They sold out. They went away from the prog rock days, and they're just writing popular music to make money or get records sold because they know people are going to like them better. I don't know. I don't like the label sold out. Like, to me, this is just what Phil Collins did. This is what he did in his solo career. This is what now he's kind of the main guy, and he's the main attraction of Genesis. So this is just where Genesis went when Peter Gabriel left and Phil Collins took over. It was just naturally going to go to a pop, more of a pop sound because of Phil Collins. That's just the way Phil Collins is. He's more of a pop guy than a prog rock guy overall. So I don't think it's selling out. It's just that's what Phil Collins is. And maybe people don't like that. I love it. I love the pop stuff. I love Phil Collins' style of music. But yeah, We Can't Dance went number 1 in the UK and number 4 in the US. So again, it's at least their 6th number 1 in the UK. I mean, they're doing really, really well there. US, again, almost top 5 album. So last couple albums have done very well in the US. They're definitely big in both countries. They come out with singles No Son of Mine, which went number 6, and I Can't Dance, which went number 7. Yeah, lots of good stuff here. This is almost an underrated album. I don't think people talk about this album as much. In fact, most Genesis fans probably put this towards the bottom of their list. For me, it's my second favorite. These are my two favorite albums, Invisible Touch and We Can't Dance, back to back. And yeah, We Can't Dance, amazing. I gave it a 9.5 out of 10. Same score as Invisible Touch. These two are just neck and neck. It's the best music and some of my favorite music I've heard. Yeah, No Son of Mine is a great song. Another just super catchy song. And I Can't Dance was more, I think, of a radio. Most of these songs I don't think were radio hits, but I think I Can't Dance might have been a radio type hit. There's another song called Tell Me Why. That's my favorite song on the album. It's another incredibly catchy song with a great chorus to it. There's another one about like Jesus is a Friend of Mine or something like that, which is another really catchy song. One of my favorite off the album. But yeah, so yeah, 14th album, We Can't Dance in 1991, another huge hit of them. But at this point, Phil Collins has had enough with the band. 14 albums in, been with them a long time. He's, of course, has this incredibly successful solo career. He doesn't really need Genesis. So he ends up quitting the band in 1996. So 5 years after this album came out, again, they weren't putting out as much at this point. They're more, seems like they're more on their solo work. And then they'd come together, it seems like every 5 years, to put out a Genesis album and put out a really, really great Genesis album. But yeah, Phil Collins decided that he had, I don't think it was no animosity. There was no like bad breakup. He just had, felt like it was time to move on and just, and I think he was having, later on he'd had some health issues, I know, but I think he was kind of done, yeah, just being with the band and just wanted to concentrate on his solo work. Oh, he really wanted to do, he really liked doing music for movies. In fact, around this time, he would do the soundtrack for Tarzan, which would be incredibly successful for him because he'd win an Oscar for You'll Be in My Heart. So he ended up winning his Oscar for that. He also does Brother Bear, another Disney movie, which is another great soundtrack. So he did put together two really good Disney soundtracks at this time. It seems like that's what he really wanted to do, some soundtrack work maybe, and this and that. So yeah, so the band's still together, actually. They put out one more album, but no Phil Collins. This is one of the biggest shock when I went through the discography. Got to the 15th album, which is called Calling All Stations. And you listen to it and it's like, oh, wait a minute, this isn't Phil Collins. I had no idea they had a third singer. Yeah, they hired a guy named Ray Wilson. They tried out a couple different guys. Again, the only two members that are throughout the whole, founding members that are throughout the whole discography is Tony Banks, the keyboard player, and Mike Rutherford, the guitar player. So them two are kind of the ones, I guess, running the show. And they decided to try one more album without Phil Collins, which I think was not a good idea because it's hard to follow. Following Peter Gabriel was hard, but they had Phil Collins, so they were able to do it. Now you're going to follow Phil Collins, it's going to be hard because Phil Collins is even more successful, I think, than Peter Gabriel, even as a solo artist and all that, and more well known. So it was definitely quite a risk to take. But yeah, so they come out in 1997 with their 15th and last album, Calling All Stations. It actually still does well in the UK, went number 2. Not number 1 though, so it did go down a little bit, I guess, but still number 2. So people are still big fans of Genesis. Even back in 1997, they were still like, oh, Genesis album, I'm gonna check it out. US, different. It went number 54. So definitely US was, I'm sure people, I would guess anything, somebody was picking up a Genesis album and being like, this isn't Phil Collins, like, this is not what I want. So I'm sure a lot of people were pretty disappointed and turned off by that. I would guess I was too when I first heard the album. It's usually like the last. People rank the albums that's usually last for good reasons, and nothing against Ray Wilson. He's a fine singer, and the album's actually not terrible. The music is okay. There's just nothing that really catches you like other albums, and yeah, it's just a mediocre album. No big hits off of it. Didn't really do that well selling wise. Like I said, went number 54 in the U.S. after it was a top 10. Last 4 or 5 albums were like top 10 albums in the U.S. But this one, really 54, man, that was a big drop from number 4 in the last album to 54, 50 spot drop. And so they were going to do a concert tour, but the tour was not selling at all. Again, I think they were like, people are like, why do I want to watch Genesis without, Peter Gabriel or Phil Collins? No offense to Ray Wilson, he just was no Phil Collins or Peter Gabriel. So I'm sure people were like, I don't want to go to a Genesis concert and Phil Collins isn't there, really go to a Phil Collins concert, you know. So I think that hurt them really badly, and so they canceled the tour and they basically quit as a band. They're like, well, this project just isn't going to work without Phil Collins, and so better just call it quits after the 15th album. So yeah, in 2000 they basically decided to they weren't going to record any more albums, and they're not going to be any more touring. So basically that was the end of the band in 2000. So pretty good. Started back in the 60s, so went a little over 30 years. So pretty good longevity for the band. Like I said, and it's crazy. Their best two albums was their last two, like third and second album to the end. To me, was their best stuff and their best selling albums and their biggest hits. And so it's like, man, they were just really on a roll. And then they end up quitting because Phil Collins was just a bigger solo act, I think, and didn't really need the band. So that's kind of what happened. It was like, what if they would have hit that peak more in the early 80s, you know, and could have had a better, like, overall 80s, 90s, you know, span. But who knows? Still great stuff. 2010, they were inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So they are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as well, anyway. So, yeah, so that's my deep dive on Genesis. Overall, it's not going to be a top 10 band for me, or maybe not top 20. I mean, it's not one of my favorite bands. Like I said, I don't like the prog rock so much, but again, I really like Phil Collins. So Phil Collins stuff, really, really good. Gets really good. For me, if I was, like I said, I'm not going to be as recommending of their albums as some other people. To me, I think you have to listen to Invisible Touch. You have to listen to We Can't Dance. You have to listen to Trick of the Tail and listen to Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. To me, those are the four I'd really recommend. They got my highest. I would say Duke maybe next. I think that was one of my favorite albums out of them. And Wind of Withering, you know, would be a recommend. But outside of those maybe 6 albums, not a lot of recommendations. Those are definitely the 6 best albums for me personally. A lot of people like Foxtrot, though. That's their biggest prog rock album. If you like prog rock, then check that one out. If you don't, like me, you're not going to enjoy that album. It's definitely not as catchy or as radio friendly of an album. So that's my take. Other people would say try Foxtrot out. Whatever. But yeah, I definitely, if you don't know Genesis, definitely check some of their albums out. Definitely check out their big singles. They got so much great stuff out of here. Anyways, and like I said, towards the end there, if they would have continued on that pop rock phase, they could be one of my favorite bands. But they only have two really great albums for me. So not a lot. Out of 15, less than half I think are good. But anyways, that's my opinion. Feel free to tell me when I'm wrong, just as long as you're nice to me. I won't delete your comment. But yeah, tell me what you think about Genesis, what your favorite album is, favorite song, favorite period. Love to read any comments you have. I hope you enjoyed my journey and deep dive into this band that I've kind of discovered recently. And yeah, and learn, hopefully if you don't know anything about Genesis, you learned a little bit too, I hope, with these videos. So that's all for me, and just thank you for watching the video. Thank you for liking it. Thank you to all my subscribers for supporting the channel. I appreciate you all. I hope you have